So hi and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature. So today's session will be the final session on this particular text, Subhadra Butalia's The Other Side of Silence. So we will conclude the text with this session. So if you remember, just quickly going back to the earlier session, we were talking about the difficulties of the form of the interview, especially when it comes to a traumatic experience. So an experience of, let's say, you narrate something which happened many years ago, and the position of the interlocutor or the position of, or the location of the interviewer becomes very, very important, because on one hand, there needs to be some kind of an emotional connect. On the other hand, if it's too emotional, if it's too close for comfort, then it becomes difficult to narrate the event. So it has to be a very fine balance between impersonality and empathetic connect, right? And that fine balance is something that Butalia, as a writer, struggles with, because this case in point here is an interview that she has of her own mother, Subhadra Butalia, with which we will conclude the session today. We see how the reluctance to remember, the reluctance to narrate the memory of partition is part of this emotional complexity, emotional and cognitive complexity, which then of course becomes a narrative complexity, right? Because she will be talking to her own daughter, right? And that's too emotional, that's too close for comfort, right? So there has to be a very thin line between proximity and distance, and that's something which Butalia struggles with. So among the many things which makes this work really unique in quality is a very honest confession of the struggle of the interviewer, the struggle to collect knowledge, the struggle to collate and calibrate knowledge, especially when it comes to a traumatic event like partition. So how do you put that in a narrative? And more importantly, how do you interview such experiences? How do you collect such experiences through the formal method of the interview? So the formality of the interview seems to be insufficient, seems to be not big enough and not complex enough to accommodate this very, very traumatic experience of partition, which is obviously some kind of a combination of geographical, physical partition, but also emotional and existential partition, because you're separated from people that you grew up with, separated by people you're tied to, connected to in kinship, in forms of kinship which are blood relationships. So for example, they talk about the trauma of leaving behind one's parents, right? Because to sort of let go of one's parents, to come away from one's parents physically, emotionally, that seemed to be unbearable in this particular situation. So Subhadra Butalia's experience of leaving behind her mother, with the knowledge that she may be unsafe, with the knowledge that she may be converted into something else, some of the religion, that becomes almost a permanent marker of trauma in her mind, which is something which we get to see. Now, in this concluding session over here, she talks about the whole idea of just before partition, the last time she visited Lahore, and after partition she went to Lahore twice, and also as we can see throughout the entire work over here, we see how the familial, sometimes petty narratives about real estate tensions, about property tensions, how that is mapped onto the bigger narrative of partition, which is sort of more national, more historical, more political in character. So the political quality and the personal quality of partition seem to be quite connected, because we're talking about real human beings, real human subjects, real families, real emotional ties, real property ties. So all these become very, very important. So this should be on your screen, the section which we will study today. This was before partition. This was in 1947. This was a little before partition. I went to Lahore twice. Both visits were before the partition, but I don't remember exactly when. Right. So again, we can see that the before partition thing is mentioned twice, and that's important for us to understand, because there's a big temporal paradigmatic existential shift before partition, after partition. So she doesn't quite remember exactly when, what month that was, which month of the year, which part of the year that was, but she remembers it was before partition, and that's something that stays in her mind. So before partition, after partition becomes the temporal existential divide, which is highlighted by the repetition over here. It comes back twice. Like a fool, I took a tonga from Lahore station to our home without any fear or anything. That was right in the midst of fights. The second time I begged and pleaded, saying, how will you feed him, etc. And then I brought Billu. In the train, he was in the other compartment. At some point, someone came and said that a boy was traveling with you. He's fallen out of the train. And I went mad. I ran, but he was perfectly safe. Then he went to Gurgaon to get a job, but of course he was a sort of a drifter. In this way, the children sort of got settled. Then I had to go to Simla, where your father was. I couldn't find any way. No trains were going there, and I kept on trying. And someone told me there were taxis, and you have to pay 600 rupees to get one seat. So I collected the money and I paid it, and I got a taxi from Delhi to Simla. I left my stuff along with Zahira Ilahi's boxes. These were never found. I left them in the care of the hostel warden. We did find the trunks later with the locks intact, but with nothing inside them. Right, so she talks about different kinds of travel, and this journey to Simla becomes a very symbolic journey. She wants to connect, she wants to go to where her husband was, and the amount of money is important. 600 rupees to get one seat in a taxi. That must have been astronomical amount at that point of time. Stratospheric, really. 600 rupees was stratospheric amount. It was a huge amount of money, and she had to collect it to get one seat in a taxi which would take her to Simla. And the symbolism of the bag, the boxes are interesting over here, because she left behind some boxes to the hostel warden, and the trunks were found later. The locks were intact, but nothing was inside them. Right, so the clinicality of disappearance is symbolized by the boxes. The locks seem to be intact, the boxes are fine, the trunks are fine, but the content inside the boxes have gone. Right, and that's a very symbolic departure, a very symbolic absence, a very symbolic disappearance, which is to suggest the permanence and the clinicality of this form of disappearance, right, which is sort of materially signified over here with these boxes. It's difficult for me to say how I felt when I saw him again after you took us back. When I saw him at the airport, I thought he was not at all like the thin, lanky youngster that I had left behind 40 years ago. He had put on weight, and it looked so much like my father. Though Bikram was also just as tall, about 6'3", he was quite fair. Rana, as he stood before me, was a virtual image of my father. So we can see how the dead father comes back, almost like reincarnated, re-embodied through Rana, which seems to suggest a very interesting interplay of materiality and spectrality that runs throughout this work. And in terms of how people remember partition, the spectral presences, they record, they resurface. So the dead father comes back, and Rana looks exactly like the dead father. I mean, he doesn't look like Rana at all to Subhadra Butalia. So when she sees him at the airport after many years, 40 years of the partition, so Rana appears to her like a reincarnated symbol or embodiment of her father, who had long since been dead. So memories flooded in of my father, my childhood, my mother, the great betrayal. Yet I found I did not hate my brother. I felt sorry for him. He looked to me like a fugitive caught in his own trap, right? And that seems to suggest the very tragic and sorry condition of the people who stayed behind in Lahore. So people like Rana, for example, people like Rana's mother, they had to convert to Islam in order to feel safe, but then they never got accepted because the conversion was an ad hoc, convenient conversion, and everyone knew around them. So they were safe, but they were never accepted. Right, so they lived an alienated life throughout the existence in Pakistan. So when she sees a brother for whom she has felt a lot of resentment for a long time, for having stayed behind, for having taken the mother, for having taken over the property. But when she sees him in Lahore, she feels sorry for him, because it's quite clear to her, it's quite evident to her that he has led a miserable life. He has led an alienated, lonely life in Pakistan. So he's a fugitive caught in his own trap. As I went and put my arms around him, he whispered, "Are you still angry with me?" I was weeping. We were children of the same parents, the same blood, yet today we were like strangers, inhabitants of two enemy countries. I thought it was not the conversion that mattered so much to me, but I could not forgive him for what he did to my mother. Right. So the first sentence he says to her when they meet is asking her if she is still angry with him, and you find that this becomes a very emotional experience for her as well. But then she realizes they are connected in a level of blood. They're connected in the same parents. They're connected from genetically in the same structure, and yet they are now strangers, politically speaking. Speaking at the level of citizenship, they inhabit two enemy countries who are at war with each other all the time, India and Pakistan. And it seems to her that what matters more at the level of not forgiving him is the fact that the mother got converted, right? And that to her seems like a bigger betrayal than his conversion, right? Because that conversion of the mother into something else symbolically suggests an entire change of the lineage to a certain extent, because his conversion to her seems to be an emotional, individual conversion, but the conversion of the mother into a different religion seems to be an attack on the entire lineage, which is more difficult for her to forgive. He brought his car to take us home. We were driven to a place which had been my home for so many years. As we drove in, I looked at the house. So the house appears, as a physical architecture, but also as an emotional, symbolic space. Some kind of a chronotop, and I think we mentioned chronotop a few times. It's a term used by Mikhail Bakhtin. Chronotop, chronotope. So chrono as in time, chronological, top as in topological or topography, so space and time put together. So the house becomes over here a symbolic chronotop, which has been unchanged in her mind for so many years, but now she's revisiting the same physical place. So what does that do to her at an emotional, existential level? It had the same majestic look, but as I peered through the dark to see, I found two things missing. My father's name no longer decorated the gate, and the big religious symbol, Om, which had been drawn on the water tank above the house, did not seem to be visible, right? So again, we find that how the conversion to Islam is more than just a semiotic change. It's more than just a convenient transformation. It sort of affects the entire architecture in a way which is quite symbolic and existential in quality, right? So the Om is missing, the letter Om, which is obviously symbolic of the Hindu sign of the house. That has gone missing, and the father's name is missing as well, right? So the disappearance of signs become interesting and symbolic and existential over here. So they extend into the existential realm, from the semiotic realm to the existential realm, and that shift becomes interesting. That transition becomes interesting. We met Rana's family, his wife and 3 sons. The 4th was away. We made ourselves comfortable. It was the month of December, but the rooms were warm, with room heaters in each of them. Pakistan has a cheap supply of piped gas. It was only in the morning that I noticed that all the fruit trees were gone. And the word Pakistan over here seems interesting, because it seems strange to her that she will have to call this a different name. It used to be just one place, one neighborhood, one village, one little town, one street, but now it's got a different name, and it just appears to be very formal and contrived, coming from someone like her. Pakistan has a cheap supply of piped gas, we are told. And then she again notices a disappearance. So what we see over here, the disappearance of trees, disappearance of the name of the father, disappearance of the sign Om. So all these disappearances become markers of this identity formation. The new identity formation is sort of informed by absence, paradoxically produced by absence, right? So the absence over here becomes a very conspicuous presence, a conspicuous symbolic sign. So the disappearance of the letter Om, the disappearance of the father's name, the disappearance of the trees. So all these absences inform the shift in identity over here, right? So the entire identity, the new identity which is formed out of Pakistan, has been formed through a series of loss and absences, and that becomes a very important instrument over here to understand the entire psychological situatedness of this particular subject. Okay, Rana said he had to get rid of them because of water shortages, but I felt a real sense of loss, an almost physical hurt. So again, we see how the disappearance of the familial markers, the familiar as well as familial markers, that extend onto some kind of a physical pain. It's almost like she's having a bodily pain at being completely distanced or disconnected from things that she had grown up with, right? And that loss of familiarity it affects her at a physical, corporeal level. My father had loved his trees more than anything else. It seemed like a betrayal. I thought we had lost so much in partition. What did a few trees matter? Yet to me, at the same time, they seemed like a symbol of everything we had lost, right? So the micro markers of loss, the loss of the letter Om, the loss of the letter of the father, the name of the father, the front door, the loss of the trees. So all these different micro markers of loss, they all coalesce together and appear in her mind as a massive symbol of loss, and everything just disappeared, and these become the symbols of what she had lost, the absences which appear over here post-partition. So, we are quite literally looking at an appearance of absence, right, through these markers, these shifting markers. That day, your friend Lala came and took me sightseeing in Lahore. So much had changed. So again, there's an irony in that she has to go sightseeing in Lahore. So the word sightseeing obviously has a touristy connotation. So she's very much a tourist. She's very much a temporary visitor. So the place that she's grown up in, she comes back as a tourist, a different kind of gaze involved away, a different kind of an experience, different kind of an engagement away. So she goes on sightseeing in Lahore. So much change. I wanted to go to Hall Road to see my old college, but when we reached there, the college was not to be seen. It had been shifted. I visited many places I had known well, but nothing was the same. This wonderful cosmopolitan city had now become a Muslim one. Loudspeakers call the faithful to prayer, shops, streets, everything was different. So the very multicultural and cosmopolitan Lahore that she had grown up in it's now become very much an Islamic city, and it just seems to be completely marked by that particular Islamic symbolism, Islamic symbols. So loudspeakers are calling people for prayer, shops are different, the streets are different. So the Lahore that she knew, which appeared to her as cosmopolitan at that point of time, seems completely different at this point of time, post-partition. So it's like a changed city. It has metamorphosed into a different kind of metropolis, which she doesn't quite recognize anymore, and in which she is very much a tourist rather than a native. So her location is also reoriented. I had been in Pakistan and a house for a full day, but I had not gone into the other rooms. I wanted very much to go into what had been my room, but I did not have the courage. So in her mind, she wanted to retain that space imaginatively. So she did not go to what used to be her room because she was afraid what might have changed, and that may have shattered her imagination, her memory in that room. Just one look beyond the drawing room made me draw back. The rooms on the other side were full of dowry articles for the impending wedding. No one seemed to be living in them. Perhaps they all lived on the first floor. At dinner, however, the whole family assembled, and we had a delicious and pleasant meal. A few days later, Rana came into our room and began to talk. He shut the door behind him. He said, if this house had not been there, I think we would all have gone together. I would not have converted and lost every moment of peace in my life, right? So suddenly this house becomes some kind of a ominous presence. He said that if only because this house is stayed back and converted, if this house were not there, I would have shifted to India as well, and I would have not have to convert into Islam. So it's all because of this particular physical building that so many psychological existential changes have happened or been forced to happen. But surely, I asked, the conversion was his choice. Yes, but he said he had still not been accepted. For them, I'm still a Hindu. If a girl had not been getting married and my presence was necessary, I might well have been in jail. We were stunned. Then he told us that one of his sons had filed a case against him, accusing him of being a Hindu spy. I'm like a stranger, he said, a man haunted in my own house by my own children. He told me time and again that he had come to one conclusion, that was that one should never change one's religion, right? So this state of being a permanent outsider to your own house seems to be something that haunts him, and he sees how his own children filed a case against him, his son filed a case against him, accusing him of being a Hindu spy. So the conversion to Islam, rather than protecting him, maybe it does at a legal level, but at an existential cultural level, he's seen with a lot of suspicion as someone who stayed back and perhaps is working for the Indian government clandestinely in a very covert way. And just to make it safe for him, is converted into Islam. So that mistrust and suspicion are all there, not just from his neighbors, not just from his relatives, not just from the people around him, but from his own blood. His own son, who's presumably was born Muslim, he looks at him with suspicion and mistrust, right? And he thinks of him as a Hindu spy working for the government of India. That alienation affects him at a daily level, and it comes to the conclusion that one should never change one's religion. And that conclusion, of course, is a political conclusion, existential conclusion, an emotional conclusion, and all come together. All these different conclusions come together, and it makes them regret the entire discourse, the entire trajectory, the entire flow of his life. But of course, he cannot go back. He cannot go back in time and change it. So he ends up blaming the house. He ends up blaming this physical monument, which presumably had forced him, or compelled him to stay back and convert, and in the process alienate himself, not just from his family, but also from his immediate surroundings at a permanent level. That was my last night in Pakistan. I remember when I sat down to eat the next morning, before we left, Rana pulled out a bowl of white butter from the refrigerator. I have not forgotten how you loved white butter. I bought it yesterday, right? So that this food becomes a marker of memory over here. It becomes a marker of emotional connect. It becomes a marker of time travel. So consuming that food is like, going back in time. The fact that I remembered her fondness for the white butter, that connects him and also enables him to go back in time and connect to her as just purely as a brother and a sister, not as a converted person, not as a post-Pakistan person, but as someone who grew up together in the same house. So the butter becomes a metaphorical connector. It becomes a marker, the gastronomic marker, the food marker through which memories are re-established, kinship is re-established, going back in time. So there's this element of time travel that happens with the arrival of the butter. He put the bowl in front of me and my eyes filled with tears. That was the last time Rana and I spoke, right? So we can see how the butter becomes a trigger for memory. It almost becomes a Proustian trigger. It just appears, and the entire sensory perception around the butter, the fact that she loved the butter, the fondness, and the fact that he remembered her fondness of the butter becomes a very interesting marker of a very strong kinship, a very strong family system, a very strong emotional blood connect, right? Which seems to transcend all the political cartographic changes that have happened subsequently. So it becomes a very important symbol for us to understand and study. I have not been able to decide whether Rana was telling the truth or not. Was this problem really one of conversion? But there are many people who have converted and stayed on. Was religion so important after all? Was he simply lying, choosing a method of survival and he had resorted to many times earlier? I don't really know. And that is the concluding section of this interview. I don't really know. So this admission of ignorance, the admission of non-knowledge, that becomes the most honest admission over here. And I don't know, the fact that I don't have any certainty about his memory, any certainty about Rana's confession, and that suspension of certainty becomes interesting over here, because that becomes a very symbolic suspension which characterizes the partition in many ways. You don't quite know who's telling the truth and who's lying, who's been manipulative and who's been sincere, and that admission of ambivalence, that admission of lack of knowledge becomes, it becomes connected, it becomes a very symbolic admission of the larger absurdity of partition, the larger unknowability of partition, the fact that we don't quite know why the partition happened, who were the victims and who were the perpetrators of partition, or who felt more lost, who got more damage. So all these questions remain unanswered and will perhaps always remain unanswered, suspended in space and time. So that concludes this section, and that concludes our reading of Subhadra Butalia's The Other Side of Silence, which ends on a moment of silence. I don't really know. There's no answer to that, right? So that lack of an answer is also a production of silence to a certain extent, a production of absence to a certain extent. And we see how absence and silence has become almost representative narrative categories in this work, which is about a very deep wound, a very deep psychological traumatic wound from which these people will never perhaps recover. Not just these people, but also the post-memory generation like Butalia herself, Subhadra Butalia herself, who makes it a project to go back in time and reconnect to our family, the family she'd never grown up with, a family she'd heard stories about, and that makes her nostalgic. Stories make her nostalgic. So the entire book becomes a project of nostalgia, a project of post-memory, or a post-memory project to a certain extent, because she belongs to that generation who had never seen partition, but who had consumed stories of partition, who now want to go back in time and rediscover and reconnect to her ties, reconnect to her kins in that system. And the entire book is about this particular project, and then it becomes more ethnographic in quality. So it's a very, very important piece of work about the partition, and it talks about how fictionality and non-fiction, fictionality and truth become almost interchangeable categories, how there is an element of narrative truth, which can sometimes be higher than factual or empirical truth, how emotional truth can sometimes be higher than factual truth, how people feel about partition may actually be more important than what really took place at an empirical, quantitative level, right? So that becomes secondary, but the emotional engagement becomes more primary, and the whole book is about the emotional depth these people suffered to, the extent to which they suffered emotionally when this entire event of partition took place. So this is a very, very important work, and it's a very important work for us, especially in a course like this, trauma and literature, because it talks about the fictionality of traumatic repetition, the fictionality which underscores any narration of trauma, which tries to move away from the real event, but which tries to sort of camouflage itself to different kinds of emotional disguises, different kinds of emotional narrations. So emotions become a very important category for traumatic recollection, and that's something which this whole book foregrounds and highlights in very complex ways. So I hope you enjoyed the sessions and this particular work. It's a very, very rewarding book. I suggest you go back and read the whole book. For the purpose of this course, we selected certain sections which we read, but from now on, we move on to the next text for this course. Thank you for your attention.